Okay, we're going to spend time today, or spend time right now, going over Article 1, Section 8, which is about the powers of Congress. And as I've been grading papers, I've been noticing that people have been leaving out things like identifying what article and what section we're talking about. That's not an option. That should always be a part of your notes. So please remember to include that as you are creating your notes. Right, so onward and upward, talking about powers of Congress. The powers of Congress are varied and many. The ones that I'm going to talk to you about right now relate to probably the most important things that Congress does. They are um, they relate to, well, let's just start at the first one. Let's start with taxes. Obviously, everybody is affected by taxes. And in what is the issue here is that the power to tax lies in the hands of Congress and to spend money for national defense and general welfare. That's their job. They're basically to run Congress. They run the government. They cannot run the government without money to do so. So the power to tax exists. And that's, to be honest, why it's number one on the list. You need the money to be able to move forward. So, general defense, of course, can be defined in many different ways, as can general welfare, which leaves it wide open for the government or Congress to tax for any number of different reasons. Number two relates directly to taxes and the money needed for, again, national defense and general welfare. Borrowing is necessary in order to, in some cases, be able to continue to do this. Borrowing is something they recognized back when they created the Constitution that was going to be necessary. But one of the things that they identified too was is that as part of borrowing, there was an obligation to repay the debt. Now, and what they've noted here is cannot be repudiated. So, and I put in parentheses for you to understand that means they cannot or recognize, refuse to recognize or pay their debt. That's an absolute must. They cannot just decide suddenly, oh, never mind, we're not paying you back. So there's no option here. However, as many of you know, our obligations or our borrowing has gotten so out of control that we continue to borrow, and yet we are not getting our debts paid off. So this has become a very concerning thing for our nation right now. I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about the regulation of commerce. This is number 3 here, is the Commerce Clause, and it covers the movement of people and things across state lines and every form of communication and transportation. This is a very broad clause, and meaning that movement of people can include most anything. Most of the time here, it means movement of people across state lines. But it does have certain obligations with relationship to movement of people. That would include rules and regulations that your car might have. It has this would allow Congress to make law with regards to things about your cars, or maybe buses, or any number of things that move people. Move people and things across state lines. Every form of communication and transportation. Obviously, communication, especially in today's world, we can communicate easily with someone in California or Hawaii or China or England. I mean, communication is broad, and in today's world, we can be connected to most anyone. So again, this regulation of these forms of communication comes from Congress. Transportation as well, even though we've talked about cars, this still does relate to things like trains and the movement of goods back and forth. It's a very broad clause and a very important clause. All right, moving on. Naturalization and bankruptcy. Now, naturalization, what we're talking about here is what are the guidelines to become a citizen. They define the requirements. Also, they get to determine who can become a citizen. Are there limitations? Are some people not permitted to be the part of our country. What would be the reasons why? These are all of the guidelines that are established by Congress. In addition, and I put a line here for you to understand that the provisions for failure to pay debt relates to bankruptcy. And what the Congress does is that it establishes those guidelines that are expected should you have to file for bankruptcy. How are you going to pay back your debts? Are you going to be able to? In bankruptcy, there's all different forms. There's Chapter 11, there's Chapter 13, and there's probably others that I'm not even aware of. But all of those provisions for paying back or being able to deal with your debt is handled by Congress. Number 5, only Congress can coin money and issue money. Coin money means make money. And there are mints which are throughout the United States which are there in order to make money and then issue money. This Federal Reserve System, this is an agency then that helps regulate our money supply. These are the guys who establish the interest rates, and then the banks all around the country will then look to them to how they should be handling money. So this is a pretty powerful agency, the Federal Reserve System. Now, counterfeiting also connects to money in that you are not permitted to reproduce American currency. It's illegal. And if you do, you might be punished. You can be punished. There is the Treasury Department, which focuses on the making and making of money, and then the counterfeiting. They are constantly looking for anyone who is trying to counterfeit or reproduce our currency, because it could cause a major problem for our economy should somebody successfully be able to counterfeit our money. As you know, our money has changed recently within the last 20 years. How money looks so much different than it once did. If you hold money up to the light, especially a $20 bill, because that is the most often counterfeited money, you'll see all kinds of different things, a watermark, a strip that goes through it. There's all kinds of things that are have changed with result of people trying to counterfeit our money. Number 7, post office. This was a system established to ensure safe and speedy transit of our communication. When this was established, the only way that we could communicate would be through letters and messages. The post office was established to make that as efficient as possible. Route 40 is an example of a post road, which was part of the post office system in an effort to get communication across the country as safely and quickly as possible. There is punishment for misuse. Yeah, you can get into a lot of trouble for driving your car and slamming into, or taking a baseball bat and slamming into post boxes. That can really cause difficulty for your life, so don't do it. Moving on, patents and copyrights. Patent and copyrights. This is a protection for authors and inventors for their work. And yes, if you download illegally, you are in violation of patents and copyrights. And yeah, there could be somebody out there who could possibly contact you and possibly cause you some difficulty for downloading without permission. I know most of you think that's silly and pay no attention to this, but it is illegal and you can get in trouble for it. All right, number 9, creating courts. Congress can create lower inferior courts and set jurisdictions and duties. Well, Congress, as we get a little further on to this, you'll know that the Constitution has already created the Supreme Court, but that was the only court it created. It left up to Congress, our founding fathers left up to Congress to create additional courts, known as inferior courts, to the Supreme Court, and to set jurisdiction and duties. And to explain jurisdiction, we're talking about areas of the law. For example, a juvenile court is a jurisdiction. So anybody who it would be a juvenile would fit within that jurisdiction. bankruptcy, talking earlier about bankruptcy, there are bankruptcy courts, and they only hear cases with relationship to jurisdiction, the jurisdiction to bankruptcy. They will not hear criminal courts, criminal cases, because that is not part of their jurisdiction. And then it established, then with these jurisdictions, then they establish the duties that fall within those jurisdictions. All right, so let's move on to the next group here. Number 10, punishing piracies and felonies committed on high seas. I put here Captain Phillips. This, if you haven't seen this movie, this is not a bad movie with relationship to punishing piracies on the high seas. Every nation possesses these powers. Traditionally, piracy has been, when you think of Blackbeard, or you're thinking of Disney's Captain Sparrow. But in fact, piracies are a modern day issue and continue to be quite a problem. And what this permits is any nation can go after those people who are punishing those people who are pirates. The movie Captain Phillips, he was captured by Somalians, and our country sent the Navy to recapture the ship. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but you can watch the movie and you can see exactly what happened to this in this situation, and it all was a result of being permitted in this clause, which is punishing piracies and felonies on the high seas. All right, number 11, only the Congress can declare war, and as a result, we have only had 2 actual declared wars, World War I and World War II. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be, obviously, there can't be additional conflicts in which our troops will go. Those are set under a different set of rules, and we'll talk about that when we get to the executive powers. Number 12, we can raise, the Congress can raise and support Army and Navy. We obviously have that. We have Army and a Navy. We also have, and since then, is kind of an update, we have the Air Force, we have the Coast Guard, and those have, the Marines, forgot those have been raised under this particular part of the Constitution. It permits the Congress to raise and support the military. Number 13 relates to state militias. There are very few state militias that exist. There were far more when this was created, but it was understood that you can, the militias can be called by states, but they are under the jurisdiction or subordinate to the powers of Congress. They cannot function necessarily independent of the federal government. 14 is governing the District of Columbia. So what this is about is it's a delegated, it's about governing the area that the capital is centered in. It has recently been delegated to locally elected government instead of the Congress being in charge. Due to the amount of work that Congress must deal with, they had to give up governing the District of Columbia so that that area could be better served by a locally elected government. This also permits Congress to govern forts, arsenals, and other places obtained from the states for the federal government purposes. In other words, if the federal government feels they need areas, they can obtain those areas from the state. But areas also include things like national parks, like, for example, Yellowstone National Park is a federal park. These parks are then governed by the Congress. All right, the next thing that I want to talk about, which is still part of the powers of Congress, is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, or also known as the Elastic Clause. All right, so let me read through this. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all the powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department of officer thereof. Now, that is the language of the Constitution. Kind of hard to understand. Basically, what it's saying is that Congress is permitted to make any laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out all the duties the Constitution has given them. In other words, all this stuff back here, they have to be able to grow with the times. And so what they did, the Founding Fathers, they placed this last piece into the Constitution under the powers of Congress that says Congress can then continue to do business by anything necessary and proper. So this is also known as the Elastic Clause. Basically, it's expanding the powers of Congress, or the powers to make laws. This says it enlarges the legislative power by enabling Congress to use any means it thinks reasonable to put these powers into action. This clause also authorizes Congress to enact legislation necessary to carry out the powers of other branches. For example, to organize or even reorganize the executive branch is possible through. Okay. This is known also as the implied powers. Basically what they're saying, within this set of circumstances, there is an implied consent, if you will, that allows Congress to do whatever is necessary and proper, back to those terms again, to fulfill the needs of the country. Congress generally may assume additional powers not specifically listed in the Constitution, but here's the thing. As long as there is a link to a power that is listed in the Constitution, they just can't make up stuff as they go. There has to be some sort of connection. The issue is it's very controversial, and as a result, it can really cause some deep problems. A lot of the people, many people, noted that they believed that the Obamacare is not an area that should have been, the Congress should have dealt with, because it doesn't have a link to any of the powers. And another group said, oh yes it did. And so there was a real controversy over this. The Supreme Court said there was a connection. So that basically ended that. Okay, that goes over the powers of Congress. What I would like for you to do then is to address this question. Explain what is meant by the Elastic Clause. Okay, come back to this, look at this. This is this relates to the question that you have right here. All right. Make sure that you place a line or something in between this question so I know where your notes stop and your question begins. Okay, thank you.